Well, it's now 1 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Laura Brewer. I work for Attorney General Stein. Thank you all for working with me over the last couple of days to get ourselves organized and on the technology here. I appreciate it. Just to set the stage a little bit about how this will go, we'll have two different sections of moderated discussion, one about law enforcement and one about the courts. When you're called on to speak in those, you'll have 3 minutes to go over your remarks, and then there'll be some back and forth for questions and then more time for questions later. If you have anything you want to add to the chat box, if other folks are talking, please feel free to do that and put your email address in it. Anything that we aren't able to get to in the course of the conversation, we can follow up with via email. And we're also saving the chat conversations for future conversations of the task force. And if you are going to ask a question, please do turn your video on. With that, I'll get it sent over to you, Attorney General Stein, to kick us off.
Thank you, Laura, for that, and thank you for your work in putting this Western North Carolina Roundtable on Criminal Justice Issues together. I very much appreciate everyone participating, and what we hope will be a really engaging period of time so we can learn about what you all are wrestling with, what ideas you have, what takeaways you think this task force should have. In the wake of the killing of Mr. George Floyd and Ms. Breonna Taylor, we were all disgusted. And Governor Cooper asked us, Justice Earls and me, if we would be willing to co-lead a task force to look at criminal justice issues to address the clear disparities in the system. I mean, this is something that Black people have known for a long time. And I think there's been an increasing appreciation among white North Carolinians and Americans that there is a real problem and that Blacks and whites are not treated equally. But he wanted us to look not just at that interaction of police and citizen, but he wanted us to look at every step of the criminal justice process so that we could address the disparities throughout. And he was also clear. He said, I'm not looking for a blue ribbon commission to write a report that goes on a bookshelf. I want an action-oriented task force that identifies real reforms appropriate for North Carolina and works for their implementation. I want to see real change brought to this system. And that is a value that Justice Earls and I share fundamentally. So the task force is about 24, 25 people. We have a broad range of perspectives. Pretty much every stakeholder you would want involved is included, from somebody who's justice involved to criminal justice reform advocates to public defenders to mayors and county commissioners and district court, superior court, appellate court, judges, sheriffs, police chiefs, line officers, statewide law enforcement folks. So we've got a wealth of perspectives, and I actually see Judge Thornburg is on as well. And Judge Thornburg is one of the members of the task force. And so we've met twice already. And at the second meeting, we universally agreed that on 3 reforms. They were a duty to, a prohibition on use of chokehold, a duty to intervene and report when law enforcement sees another one exceeding their authority, and a recommendation to the Supreme Court to adopt a rule that judges take into account a person's ability to pay before levying a fine or fee. We don't want to criminalize poverty. And these were just preliminary or initial steps. We have much, much more work to do, but it was something on which we all had broad consensus, and we wanted to show that we were going to be taking action as quickly as possible, with a whole lot more work to come. What will inform our work is you all, which is why we've had one public forum for anyone to sign up statewide. And now we're engaged in a series of regional roundtables where we can hear from stakeholders and community leaders from different parts of North Carolina to share what their thoughts are. What do they see as changes that need to be made? And what do they think that's working? What are you doing in your area that you think that the rest of the state should take under consideration? And that's what we are, as the task force, want to do. In terms of how we're going to do today, we're going to break it up into 2 broad issues. We're going to talk about law enforcement, policing, sheriff work on the front end, and then we'll talk about the courts and post conviction on the second half of the discussion. And I'll lead the preliminary discussion. Justice Earls will lead the second part of the discussion. But we really wanted to hear from you. We want to learn about what's working from your perspective and what isn't. We have 4 work groups, and I'll let Justice Earls mention the work groups as well as give you all greetings. But thank you again so much for participating.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I am enormously grateful to you for joining us and giving us the benefit of your wisdom. Your input comes at a really crucial time in the work of the task force. We have until December 1st to come up with our recommendations, and then the whole next year and a half of our existence is intended to be devoted to fostering and implementing those changes, those recommendations. And I think it's important to keep in mind our core mission, which is to develop and help implement solutions that will eliminate disparate outcomes in the criminal justice system. So racial disparities are what we are trying to address. And each of those 4 work groups that Attorney General Stein mentioned has already met once. So we've begun to consider some recommendations, but we wanted to have these listening sessions because we know we wanted an opportunity for greater dialogue and delve a little deeper than the 2 minutes we get from the public in general when we have our public hearings, and we've had one. We have another one set up for Thursday, September 3rd in the evening. So we really truly are trying to engage the community. But in addition to having a more in-depth discussion, this is an opportunity for us to learn about what is happening in your community as distinct from the rest of the state. And we know that while there are many similarities, there are also some important differences. And so hearing directly from you, leaders in your community, is really key for us. I just want to emphasize a couple of additional things. We are not about just making changes for change's sake. It's vitally important that we understand what the key issues are that are creating these racial disparities, and then implement solutions that actually work. So to the extent we can hear from you about things that have that you've done in Asheville that have worked, or things you've seen in other places that you think would be useful solutions, that's really helpful to us as well. I also want to emphasize that all of you are part of the solution. The task force is an advisory task force. And while we do have great representation, and I want to urge you to know that the other task force members are in fact on watching live. You just don't see their pictures on the screen, but there is broad participation from the other task force members. But we don't have the magic wand to wave and make all of this happen. So it's really going to be people like you who care about these issues, who take the time to be engaged, who have background experience, knowledge, and in some instances are in decision-making roles. You are really the ones who can implement and make real the changes that we need. And so finally, I'll just conclude. Some of you may know, for 30 years, I was a civil rights attorney, and for the first 10 years, I litigated cases involving police misconduct, including a case in Asheville. So this would have been in the 1990s, and I know much has changed since then. But I think the basic notion that that people really do care about this task force, the issues that we're addressing and the work that we're trying to engage in, is really important to a lot of people throughout the state. And so that's why it is so valuable to have your time and effort to lend to our work. I don't underestimate the task that we have been that's been placed upon this. The effort is not an easy one, but I also know that we have a good collection of people desiring of making these changes, and we have all of you. So without further ado, I'll turn it back to Attorney General Stein to get us kicked off.
Thank you, Justice Earls. Yeah, let's start with that first moment of where officers engage with the people, with the citizens that they serve. because that's really what triggered this whole national reckoning on race, the killing of George Floyd. And Bob Clark, I think you're on. If you
Sure.
would talk about that issue of kind of use of force and the interaction between law enforcement and people, we would welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, well, when given 3 minutes, and I'm kicking the timer off now, you know, the first word that comes to mind I'll touch on is de-escalation. And when I looked at that in the broadest terms, the sort of my 3 bullet points, number one was we have to have enhanced mental health for all sorts of reasons. You know, it's a bigger picture, universal health care, getting a little away from what we're doing. But the clients I saw as a public defender, who I later would see as defendants when I prosecuted, about a third of my jail population wouldn't have been there if they'd had some good mental health treatment, places to go. So that's kind of number one in my book. It also would reduce the number of confrontations that officers would have. So again, I put that as de-escalation. It's great to have it at 0 if you don't have to have a conflict with someone. And again, the double-edged sword is a whole bunch of my clients, if they were in some sort of supported living place, bus transportation out front, they'd be tax-paying citizens. So that's one thing I feel strongly about, but I know that also bring relief to officer confrontations. And wherever the political will is, it hasn't been there. And I'm out of my career now. It's 14 years prosecuted, 10 years public defender in 2 different places. Same places I prosecuted, I also public defended. But frankly, we have to pay more for officers, period. But if you're going to do that, we need to require more. And again, I know it's not directly on what's going on with the hands on a person in the street, but to de-escalate, if a person, I would say an entry-level officer, deputy ought to have 2 years of post-high school education, and then some sort of ranking, getting up to, leave that to the sheriffs and the police chiefs, but a 4-year degree to get on up in the police work and be paid accordingly. Because I'm kind of tired of, you know, what we hear about how great we love our police officers and we love this and our essential workers. And I've just heard a lot of words about that, not follow through. And it would give an officer more early exposure in life to diverse opinions, diverse people, and how problems are solved in a truly collegial setting. Coming to how we look at law enforcement, of course, the defund, refund, alter words that are going through is, I truly believe we need a public safety office where you would combine law enforcement as its own unit, but hopefully within the same building in a small town like us. And sorry, let me try to cancel that. Have social workers and police where social worker can respond to certain calls, domestic calls, the one where somebody's wandering in the street talking out of his head. We just can't put that on a police officer to be the law enforcement officer that keep the public safe and deal with a mental health issue. So very briefly, those, many of you here have been out on domestic calls. If the officer can deal with the perpetrator or perceived perpetrator, male or female, social worker can deal with the other parent and the crying children, everybody gets off to a better start. And lastly, as to de-escalation, and I'm sure you, Mr. Stein, know Chief Hollingshead probably from the amount of stuff he's done in the state. He's just been a master at getting the officers here to de-escalate. And again, I think the balance of helping social workers and police being able to sometimes handle calls together, or at least have follow-up together and work closely and give respect across those 2 professions, that'll lead to a lot of the de-escalation.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Appreciate those comments. Yeah, the notion of paying officers more so it's a more attractive profession, but at the same time, right sizing what it is we ask of them, because we have failures with our mental health system. We have failures with our healthcare system as it relates to addiction. A lot of people don't have access to healthcare. And when they don't, then we expect police and sheriffs, the law enforcement, to be the catchment of all of our social problems. And then police officers are not only being peace officers, they're also having to be drug counselors and social workers, all the things you just described. And I like your idea of having a broader notion of what is public safety and what's the appropriate skill set and personnel to respond to various types of calls. One thing that we've done at the Department of Justice is push an idea called the Criminal Justice Fellows Program. I'm sure most of you have heard about the North Carolina Teaching Fellows Program, where they identify really public spirited high school seniors and then pay for them to go to college for 4 years. And if they go in and teach in North Carolina schools, their loan will be forgiven. And we want exactly the same idea for law enforcement, that we want to identify those public spirited high schoolers who want to go into law enforcement, pay for 2 years of community college. And then if they serve in law enforcement for 4 years, their loans will be forgiven. And the legislature has authorized that, but not for all counties. I think Buncombe would be excluded, but the other Western North Carolina counties would not be. They could participate, but they haven't funded it yet. And so we need to get that kind of.
It looks like Attorney General Stein's internet has frozen. Justice Earls, I know the next person he was going to call on was the sheriff. Do you want to maybe move us along?
Yes, thank you. I was hoping that it would pop back on, but I'm sure he'll be back with us in just a moment. But to keep things moving, our next speaker to talk about law enforcement culture and accountability is Michael Hayes. I don't see him on. So that would bring us to Chief Freeman to talk with us about training. And then if Mr. Hayes comes on, we'll go back to him.
First, let me thank everyone for the opportunity. I am Sean Freeman with Black Mountain. I've got over 29 years of law enforcement experience in the state of North Carolina. You know, I'm very passionate about this profession, and I want to leave the profession much better than the way that I came into it, along with the communities. And with that said, you know, I agree with what Mr. Clark stated with the we have to pay more to get quality. But I think from the training aspect, if we truly want true police reform from the law enforcement aspect, and we want to add the preservation of life and professional change, we have to start with a foundation of where law enforcement, where officers are molded, which is in our BLET programs across the state. First, you know, I think that we need to evaluate our BLET programs in each of the institutions that teach it, because we need to standardize this across the state. I've found in the various institutions I've taught in, we have some institutions that focus on the aspect of physical fitness, some focus on the legal aspect, and some focus on, you know, techniques. And every single one of these are very, very important to the job, and they each deserve equal recognition. But where we're failing in our teaching is we're failing in the use of force blocks of instruction to teach things like de-escalation, teach things like critical incident training, intervention for those that have the mental issues. We've got to start adding those, not only just as an independent block of instruction, but we need to embed those in everything from our uses of force, what we call SCAT training, subject control and arrest techniques, anything like taser or ASP or anything, because the first thing, our best tool is our words, how we talk to people, how we interact with people. And so therefore we have got to get our officers in the very basic stages used to the de-escalation techniques and how they interact with our citizens, because you can talk, I found in 29 years, you can talk someone easily into an argument, or you can talk them down to where you can come up with successful resolutions. So we have to teach our new officers this on a foundational level. I think, you know, one of the things that I've seen is a way to do that. South Carolina has basically one teaching institution for all law enforcement. Now, let me say immediately that I'm not, you know, advocating for one training institution, but what that does do is it allows for both state and local law enforcement to be trained on a basic level the exact same way. So you're getting a very good product across the state that is consistent. And next, I want to talk about, you know, the law enforcement training. You know, in BLET, we have to introduce de-escalation into this. We have to introduce critical intervention training into this as well, where we bring officers straight out of basic law enforcement training with certifications in these aspects on how to de-escalate, how to talk and help the subjects that may have the mental issues that we're talking about. And in these, we have to also intertwine and look at on a local level, you know, what agencies do we have to partner with that can help facilitate these? And we have a very good networking system here in Buncombe County that we use quite often, whether it be from domestic violence shelter or even from the aspect of getting help for those that have mental issues. We have to also look at the possibility of, or the necessity of mandating this type of training also into our mandated yearly in-service, because of the amount of officers who did not get this type of training while they were in basic law enforcement training. Now, we'll say from a standpoint of North Carolina in a lot of ways is ahead of some of the national standards, but we can't be complacent with where we are. We've got to constantly look at improving this. And so with that said, we also need to look at things such as the Brady-Giglio Act. We have to teach officers things that allow them to know that you know, their conduct can become impeachable and it jeopardizes their law enforcement certification, that there is consequences for every action they do, whether it be good consequences or bad consequences. I'm trying to limit this really quick, so I'm really skimming across what I've prepared. But I could go on with a lot of different areas, but we have to start with that foundational level. We have to increase the number of hours that we have in BLET to be able to institute all these additions of de-escalation, talking about implicit bias training as well. We need to be able to extend those hours from 640 to whatever it takes to make sure that we're turning out, you know, a good officer and putting them in a community and where, you know, they're representative of the demographics of that community, but not only that, but that they're going to be a plus to that department and help with all the issues that we're seeing today. So I'll just kind of end it with that. You know, we have an obligation here, and I like the fact that you guys are discussing the fact of long term. What I see far too many times is, and what I hear from my citizens is far too many times there's been lip service, meaning that we say the right things, we say the things that need to be done, but we always fall short of pushing and working toward those goals. And I like the fact that this task force is looking to continue on with this and to get these goals enacted. And we need to strive to constantly better this profession, but not only for the officers, the new officers we're putting in the field, but we have to do it for those we serve more importantly. And I'll kind of end it with that. So I think I'm probably a little over my 3 minutes now.
Chief Freeman, thank you so much. I'm back. Sorry for the Wi-Fi problems here at my house. Sheriff Miller, can you talk to us about recruiting and other issues that you think are important to make sure that we have the right people serving? You know, we want those guardians more than we want the warriors. And how do we go about doing that? What do you think for us?
First, thank you for this opportunity, and keeping in mind that only have 3 minutes, so I'm gonna be real quick, if you will. But also, I just want to make note that I see that I'm under Brenda Page, but I'm actually Quentin Miller, the sheriff here in Buncombe County, for those who don't know.
I figured that was you. I figured it.
But moving forward, I first would tell you that the representation really matters. We start looking at a lot of firsts here in North Carolina. We look at first with women and people of color in leadership roles. You know, having the Chief Justice Beasley and Justice Earls is definitely, for me, a move in the right direction, because it gives our young women the idea that they too could meet and reach that level. So I find that very important. I also look at the number of African-American sheriffs that have been elected. And again, I think that's something that reflective to our communities of color, giving them opportunity to see that, you know, that we do have people of color in these positions. I feel that's very important. We talk about how do we go about recruiting, and we start talking about the pay. I think a lot of this speaks to how do we, you know, some kind of way incorporate our HBCUs, historic Black colleges, into how do we recruit folks from these schools to be a part of law enforcement. And let me say that I do understand that this is an uphill battle, that not only for here locally in Western North Carolina, but throughout the state. So the challenge is going to be very challenging. I heard you speak about scholarships. So I guess my first question is about North Carolina not being one of, Buncombe County not being one of the counties. And I think I did read something on it about the population is the reason why. And so I would first ask that we address something that, you know, Buncombe County would be included, because we still have the same jobs and duties of everyone else, you know, in the other counties. So I would ask that we consider that something to look at. And, you know, we spoke about the starting salaries and that being an issue, but also we have to ask ourselves about, you know, we hear about folks talking about intentional hiring. We want to be intentional about hiring, but we also want to be intentional about qualified hiring. And so we don't want to just hire just because it's people of color. And can't speak for everyone, but I would tell you that we just want an even playing field. And we don't want no handouts or you give us anything, especially in law enforcement. But also, I appreciate what Chief Freeman said. And I want to add to that, when we start talking about training and BLET, I just really feel that we got to start talking about the mindset of individuals. When you spoke about the guardian to warrior mentality, and that being part of the training at BLET, because I truly believe that we could have all the training in the world, but if our mindset has not changed in how we need to be policing, the training means nothing. And so I was, you know, challenge, you know, this task force to look at how do we talk a good game about changing the warrior mentality to that of a guardian, but what does that look like? What does that really mean? And so when we start talking to BLET and reforming and changing the BLET, are we willing now, or are we ready now to have this bold conversation about what does that really mean and what does that look like? Because here lately I've been asked to, you know, be on panels and these different conversations. And again, I think for me, we're still missing the real concept of it's about our mind change in law enforcement. You know, and yes, I would tell you that we ask law enforcement to do a lot, and they're underpaid. And I would tell you that a lot of us come in the profession knowing that in advance. But I will tell you that it's time for a change, and it is time for us not to do a lot of talking about it and to be about it. And some of that is how do we change the mindsets of people coming in law enforcement, people in law enforcement, and start talking about the future of law enforcement. And I'll close with this. I know my 3 minutes is probably up, but I want to close with this. When we start talking about the duty to intervene, and I do appreciate that, but also we have to hold our community to some level of their duty to intervene. And I'm not going to back down from that, because I still continue to say this is about how we work together as a community to solve the issues that we're faced with, and that we must do that as a community. It's not just law enforcement, it's us as a community. And again, thank you.
Sheriff, thank you for all those comments. Very, very helpful. Yeah, we need to recruit the right people. We need to train them right, but we have to have the right culture within law enforcement, and creating that culture is a real challenge. I didn't know Mayor or you, Deborah, city manager, if you all wanted to talk about some of what you all are doing in Nashville to try to rebuild that trust between law enforcement, the police, and the people they serve.
Deborah, you want me to go ahead? Can you guys hear me okay?
Very well, thank you.
Okay. I will say that is a very big challenge, working in community and developing that level of trust. Deborah and I, along with our chief, just recently met with a group of African-American pastors in Asheville, socially distanced in a church. And what they talked about a lot was knowing their neighborhood officers, being able to know them by name, and being able to build that trust that comes with a genuine relationship. So that was something that we talked about there. But I will tell you, since this group is working on a kind of a bigger statewide effort, some things that we've been working on in Asheville for quite some time, because unfortunately we've managed to make the national news more than once in this arena. It is things like a civilian review board. We don't have a civilian review board in Asheville. We don't have local legislation authorizing a civilian review board. There is not statewide legislation that allows for a civilian review board. And I think, I know there's conflicting results in different communities that have them, but the idea that a civilian review board could look at body cam footage or personnel records and be and a place where people can bring their complaints, their concerns, and it's not a body of just law enforcement, would make a big difference. So I know there's legislation that's been introduced in North Carolina to do that, and it hasn't gone anywhere. Also, we have a civil service board. We're one of 6 cities in the state that have a civil service board, and Terry's grinning because we've been trying to crack this nut for a long time. And our civil service board uniquely has the ability to reinstate terminated officers, which it has done, and which we've appealed to the Court of Appeals and we've lost. Body cam footage, that made a big difference in our community to be able to have, obviously, body cam footage, and that swings both ways. But I think when it nets out, it's very important for community trust to have body cam footage. But of course, nobody can see it in North Carolina unless you're in it. And that's something else we've asked for and advocated for, to see a change in, or at least allow city councils to see it. So we can see it in closed session and makes it, and I know that also was debated in the legislature. So there's some statewide things that I think might help cities have some tools to be able to create more trust in community around policing efforts. I completely agree with all of what I've heard about training. I will say that I have heard a lot from folks inside and outside the department that just training alone does not change a culture, and you can get a lot of eye rolling and I'm going to another one of these trainings and blah, 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 and I don't care. But you've got to get folks, good folks that really buy into why they're having this training and looking at these numbers. I mean, we have great disparity in our stop data in Asheville. And, really digging into understanding why that is, and just getting some grassroots buy-in, that is been very inconsistent. And unfortunately, I think one of the major contributors to it right now is the politics around it. It's become, you should see my email stream. It's like we have polar opposites happening here, unfortunately. It's become very political. Deborah, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Sure. Excuse me. I also support and appreciate all the comments that have been made earlier around this subject matter. But let me just start with our community in Asheville, as the mayor said, is very polarized. And I think that is reflective not only at the local level, but at state and national level. I mean, there are lots of opinions about how to crack this nut. But what we're trying to do in Asheville is actually utilize a lot of input. I mean, we've been having this conversation a lot around how do you enhance and improve working relationships between law enforcement or police officers and our community. And what we have committed to do is truly not only listen, but to also try to implement. And there are things that we have done. And I think the city can really pat itself on the back. A lot of the national things, the 8 Can't Wait, and a number of those initiatives have been adopted in Asheville. Our challenge is how are these policies translated to daily, operational protocol for our police officers on the street. And when they encounter an individual, do they remember the policy or their training? And what we're trying to do, again, is understand what is the type of public safety approach that is needed for our community to truly feel safe and to gain some level of not only trust, but also accountability when there is misconduct. And I think those are the two major issues is, do we trust our law enforcement officers? And then if we don't have that trust, if there is no accountability at the end of the road, we'll never earn or gain that trust. And so we're working on that, and it is not going to be something that happens overnight. This is going to be a journey, and we've got a lot of work to do. It's going to be some heavy lifting, and I think we've got to engage. We talked earlier about the polarization. We've got to engage both sides of that coin in this discussion, and I know that right now the squeaky wheel is getting the grease. But we're committed to listening to all those voices and all those sides. And I again commend and thank the governor for wanting to have this conversation on a statewide level. But I think and I hope that the state will truly listen to the boots on the ground and the grassroots folks who are working to address this issue, and that it not be so top down in terms of recommendations and changes. So thank you.
I thank both of you very much. I mean, I think what you each underscored is that culture and the public's faith in local law enforcement doesn't change with a light switch. Like it takes work. It takes a whole lot of different ideas and commitment over a period of time to change things in a way that can really make a difference in a community. So I appreciate both of you guys. We have a couple minutes left in this section of the discussion, so I wanted to open it up to other panelists, participants, to see if anybody else wants to comment on any of these issues as it involves law enforcement, whether it's the use of force, whether it's the culture, the accountability mechanisms, the training, recruitment. Anyone who would like to weigh in is welcome to at this point. Just wave your hand and I'll call on you. And if you're not video, just use the raise hand function on the program, or put a comment in the comment section, chat section, and we'll know to call on you.
Can I raise my hand?
I think you have that right.
Thank you, because I really want to follow up on something that Deborah Campbell said about the recommendation should not be top down, and really following up on a lot of what you were saying. How can a statewide task force, or how do you see, what can we do to support your efforts? I mean, there's the obvious, don't get in the way, but beyond that, what could you use? And I'm also hearing possibly legislation that creates a civilian review board that has real teeth, that has subpoena power, the ability to get body cam footage, personnel records. Anything else that you would identify as things that at the state level we could do that would support your efforts?
Well, I don't know specifically that we have reached some definitive things in terms of a path forward, but I would suggest to you that communities like Charlotte and Asheville and Greensboro and Durham, we all are having these conversations at the local level. And there will likely be some things that come out of these conversations that we will need the state to assist us and help us. I mean, you've already heard some things about training and resources for us to help increase the people that we recruit to be law enforcement officers. We truly need a lot of help in terms of figuring out how do we, I will say, diversify or have a more diverse police force. I remember when we had the demonstrations, I looked out at the personnel in our officers that were lined up, and they looked actually very homogenous, and that was kind of scary, and that's what's happening throughout. So if there are strategies in terms of recruitment or funding opportunities or grants or things that we can truly get, and I think the sheriff for Buncombe County, Quentin, talked about how do we really recruit people that are more reflective of the community that they serve, and we just haven't reached that yet. So I would hope that some of those ideas, but I still think also that the story is unveiling, and that there's more to come, and there are more ideas that we would like to share with a task force like this as we continue our conversations.
That's great. And it actually dovetails with what we heard with conversation with Chief Davis, who's the police chief in Durham, and they've been really wrestling with how do they make sure that their department reflects the diversity and the community that lives in Durham. And they've got a whole bunch of really creative and ambitious outreach efforts. And so one thing we're considering doing as a task force is to come up with some model outreach, affirmative action outreach efforts, and then share that with cities that want kind of as a best practice. Another one of our task force members is a Buncombe County resident, Angelica Wind, and she has just joined us. And Angelica, would you like to weigh into this discussion? If so, you can unmute.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm just curious. We talk about culture and culture change, and we know that the folks at the top are so instrumental in creating a culture, right? Because officers or, staff will model what the leader models as well. So I'm curious what do we see as a challenge in terms of law enforcement leadership in changing culture, other than it's the right thing to do, like challenges to changing culture that may be addressed through the task force and recommendations?
Hey, Tiffany, I saw you kind of raise your finger. You want to respond to that?
Yeah, Angelica, that's what I've been thinking through as well. And listening to our discussions and thinking about like the incidents with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, it's like what resonated with me most is these individuals weren't demonstrating mental health crisis. So if there was a de-escalation or a CIT trained officer coming out, I mean, there was no mental health crisis to respond to. And I think we have to take stock at addressing what racism looks like in our criminal justice system. And so not only implicit bias, but digging a little bit deeper and talking about structural racism. And having a willingness to learn more, having a willingness for BLET to be looked through a racial equity lens, look at how the information is being taught, who is being taught to. I think that's going to also play when it comes into recruitment, because most Black, brown bodies have been traumatized by law enforcement. And so reaching out, and not even if they were directly traumatized, but even indirectly traumatized. And so trying to recruit into that profession without healing some of that trauma would definitely be difficult, also with gaining trust to community as well. So really being intentional in addressing racial equity and evaluating BLET through a racial equity lens, any of our practices and policies. I'm thinking law enforcement, like what does citations look like in lieu of arrest? And so, working with law enforcement, following the general statutes that's clearly outlined of the discretion to use an arrest versus a citation, and making sure when somebody's booked into the jail and staying there, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit later, but thinking about the use of our local detention facility and how it's used are just some things that I can think of that might be in law enforcement's wheelhouse. So
That's great, Tiffany. Thank you. Angelica, anything else?
General, can I say, I'm sorry, I would never get in front of the senator. Go ahead, Terry.
I feel like I am the least qualified person to say anything in this group. You guys are all awesome, but in my background, one of the key factors for success is management. And although I appreciate the emphasis on training, I have not yet heard anyone talk about management training. Are we training our supervisors, our captains, our chiefs of police, our sheriffs, in how to implement training? I had the privilege of doing a day of de-escalation training with the Asheville Police Department. And I came away thinking, this is something that has to be reinforced on a daily basis. And so it seems to me that we also have to make sure, we may be doing this, that's why I feel uncomfortable talking, but we need to make sure that our management structures are all on the same page in order to make the cultural changes that you're talking about. It can't be just sending somebody to a week of training. We need to make sure when they come back from training that the supervising staff understands how to reinforce that. And I'm not hearing a lot of that in discussions at any level in terms of how we continue to move forward.
That's great, Terry. That's something we'll take back to the working group that's going to be looking at these training issues to make sure that we're looking at training not only for line officers and new officers, but also management. So appreciate that. Judge Thornburg?
Yeah, this is for the chief and the sheriff. We've heard interest from a number of folks with regard to these citizen review boards. And they're having investigative subpoena enforcement powers very specifically. And as far as I know, none of them do across the state. We have some across the state. I don't think that kind of authority And I would just like to get your input on that, or how you would approach how we should look at this idea of making citizen review boards more impactful and more efficient.
Chief, Sheriff, Sheriff, you want to take first stab at that?
Yes, I would. Judge Thornburg is aware of our Sheriff Advisory Committee that we have, which we've actually moved forward with allowing them to not only hear disciplinary issues, but being a part of our hiring process as well as our promotion process. So I agree that there needs to be, actually, we want more people, Judge. I was trying to get a hold of you to tell you that. So I got you. I'm gonna pass that on. We want to increase hours from 5 to 7. And hopefully that will be something that we can move forward on, which gives us the ability to not only look at disciplinary actions, but I think we have to have some type of data bank that says that when an officer is, and I'm gonna say it hopefully correctly, that we allow them to resign instead of terminating them. And that allows them to go to other places to seek employment. And I would hope that we would have something in place that whatever they would do here in Buncombe County would follow them throughout the state, so that, we're able to then, have information that we would not even hire folks that have been allowed to resign. So I'm very interested in that.
That's a helpful form of accountability. Chief Freeman, would you welcome a Citizens Review Board? And if so, how much authority should they have? And kind of just tell us what you're thinking, the pluses and the minuses from your perspective.
So I believe that, where citizens are concerned, we have to have buy-in, and we have to be as transparent as we can. We've already taken some steps going into similar directions, such as we have a community stakeholders group where we pull, all demographics in to sit down to have a good, hard discussion, kind of like what this task force is doing now. And we meet sometimes bi-weekly, and sometimes there's issues that we need to, meet even sooner. But nonetheless, we have to be transparent. We've taken the steps to allow citizens to come in and set our hiring processes, because it's very important that we pull people who are not only a good fit for the department, but more importantly, a good fit for the community. So we have, we go through the citizens we encounter and pull them in on all kinds of processes, such as the hiring and the promotional process. I think, we took a good step last week here in Buncombe County with the Brady Giglio MOU that we put into place, again, for transparency. But now to move forward into talking about the citizen review groups, I think that, my opinion would be that that could only strengthen, the bonds between the citizens we serve and the police departments here. And if we're talking about true transparency, that is one strong step toward ensuring a transparency with our community and them being a process or a step in the process within these departments. So again, I'm kind of like the sheriff, I totally agree with this.
Thank you. And I want to just put this comment out in case y'all aren't looking at the chat, but Chief Letney, who is one of the members of the task force, made a comment that for criminal justice training and standards, there's a form called Form 5B, F5B, where the reason for ending a police officer's employment needs to be documented on there. So it's a partial step to trying to address the point you raised, Sheriff Miller, but it may not be seamless. There may be cracks that people are still dropping through. And so that's definitely something we want to look at to make sure that that officers don't just go from one department to another when they've had a history of mistreating the public.
Can I just add to that on that F5, it gives you an option, if I'm not mistaken, to say if there was criminal activity, but it does not go into explaining, if there was under investigation, you can in fact, say that there's an ongoing investigation that was part of the resignation. But I still think that on the form itself, I don't know if there is information to put that information there. You can call and do the research and get there. But I would like to have something more solid, but I'll go back and check that to make sure.
Yeah, we'll do the same. I mean, I'll take that issue back to the working group and they'll wrestle with it and make sure that we're trying to do the best we can to make sure there aren't cracks where people can just slip through and go from department to department and cause problems wherever they are.
Can I add one more thing, sir?
Of course.
Talking about falling through the cracks, you know, we had an issue here where an employee contested and it came down to a non-disclosure agreement. We had to actually reach out to Steve Combs to figure out how to exactly put that in there. That is one prime way that things do slip through the crack. But I think too, when we start talking about this, there needs to be some sort of database that sheriffs and chiefs, when we're hiring, we can click into that and, you know, ourselves and be able to look at the background rather than sending. I mean, it's a lot of work, and I will say the work. It's takes a while to get like the forms and everything back from a previous employer through training and standards or the sheriff's commission. We need somehow, some way to categorize those into some sort of database that once you become a chief, once you become a sheriff, you have access into that database, because while it may not be anything serious in the eyes of some, it's definitely red flags that we can look at to help us determine whether this person is going to be a good fit for, you know, our department, but more importantly for the profession as well. So somehow we need to be able to categorize that where we can see it instantaneously.
That is another very helpful comment. Anything else on the issue of law enforcement before we move on to the second part of our agenda today? All right, Justice Earls.
Thank you. And I do want to move to the court system, but I just quickly, if I can, would like to follow up on something that both Senator Van Dyne talked about and the mayor mentioned, because in talking about management, it strikes me that you can't manage what you don't measure. And the mayor talked about how you know that in, and I don't know if it was Asheville or Buncombe County, but you know that there's a disparate rate of traffic stops that African-American motorists are stopped more often. So you must be looking at that data. And I'm just wondering, is that data useful to law enforcement managers as a way of, you know, managing police officers? And I think there might be other data that would be more useful, so that'd be good to hear. I do know that it sort of legally, the concept of supervisory liability when there is a use of excessive force is sort of out there in our doctrine, but not very well developed. But I'm just curious whether the traffic stop data or some other kind of data would assist in the law enforcement management task.
So I know enough about this to be dangerous, but we have our own data that we track, and the state requires, and maybe the Attorney General knows more about this, the state requires certain data sets that we track, but there's not, to my knowledge, for example, a uniform use of force policy. So we have a use of force policy that we wrote in Asheville, and we're actually rewriting it because we're finding that the threshold was to trigger a review of use of force was not strict enough. It was pretty lenient. So, that's kind of an interesting, it's kind of like discipline in school systems. It's like you go from one school system to another and you see these different policies. So it's very, to my knowledge, I don't know how consistent it is. Plus it's incredibly subjective. I mean, obviously one officer reviews use of force, body cam footage, and another one, and they may have different opinions, so to me, that's tricky. But we do collect a lot of data and we use that. And again, I don't know how much of that is managed by the state and how much of it is, but we can tell you everything. We can tell you every stop we've made, every arrest we've made in a month. We can tell you what every call was for. We can tell you all of that information. And I just want to add, I mean, I know the Attorney General asked if there's any other comment. I didn't pipe up, but to me, if you're talking about, when we're talking about training officers and we're talking about the culture in a department and we're talking about the stop data and use of force and all these different policies and procedures, we're already within this thing called the police department, and the police department is charged with doing all this stuff. I mean, to me, what we're talking about in Asheville is reimagining policing, and really, what does that look like? Maybe we have people who are not sworn officers that are now handling all kinds of issues in our community, like mental health and substance abuse and homelessness. But it would be so helpful to me if there was a deep dive into the data to see, you know, how many of the calls concern issues dealing with mental health, issues dealing with substance abuse, you know, and is it really feasible to peel off that work to folks that are not sworn officers? Is that like an expansion of the county services and the county, because the county's already set up with Department of Health and Human Services and other kinds of services? Is that like how we transform that? I mean, to me, you know, I unfortunately, since we have had to learn so much about all of this here, which is odd for me coming in as a land planner more than 10 years ago, is that, you know, some of the experts that we've talked to basically say, you know, you can't really change humans, but you can change policies, you can change procedures, you can change structures. So, you know, I mean, that is a real top-down structure change that would be necessary for cities to really be able to make those shifts.
Thank you. Sheriff Miller.
Can I comment? So
Please do.
I think we also have to be mindful that safety becomes an issue when these law enforcement folks go out. And, you know, we thought about mental health and have mental health respond, but I still believe that there has to be some accountability, not only to our position to keep people safe. And so I notice this is somewhat a challenging conversation, but I think we still have to keep in mind that when the law enforcement officers show up, that he must be there in some capacity to keep the scene safe. So I don't want us to, you know, overthink this, thinking that we could send someone from the community with mental health expertise or substance abuse expertise, but we still want to have someone there who have the ability to try to keep the scene as safe as possible.
Would it work? Would it work to send them together?
Exactly.
Yes, I think very much so that that should be the idea, send them together. And even then, you know, have it so that, you know, when they arrive, you know, make a determination what's needed at that point. If the scene is safe, not that law enforcement have to leave the scene, but they can, you know, stand back, become the second, you know, the person in that situation. And if it's a situation where it wasn't safe, let law enforcement take the lead, get the situation safe, then turn it over to hopefully, without it being a situation where we now must enforce an arrest, that they could now get the services they would need from a mental health or substance abuse issue, opposed to, we'll get to this later, but you know, that seems to be our answer now, is to arrest or incarcerate people for their mental health and substance abuse.
And can I add to that, please? I think it's important.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay. I'm glad the sheriff brought that up. I do want to acknowledge that that process exists now. We do have mobile crisis services and CIT trained officers that go out now. Again, I think that was a point made about with services on the behavioral health side, do we really have the structure in place to do that? And it also circles back around to our racial and implicit biases, because both the officer and mobile crisis responder may be coming to that scene and looking and approaching it differently based on some one's color of their skin. So regardless of like how much people we try to put in place or services, we need to make sure it's done with a racial equity lens. And we need to make sure people are culturally competent to respond to whatever crisis or situation is occurring.
Well, thank you all for that. Further response, and I'll say that reimagining the role of police is one of the topics that one of the work groups explicitly has on its agenda, even though framed that way, it was not explicitly in the executive order. So all of your comments are very timely in terms of what we're wrestling with. I do want to turn to the court system, and I'm gonna we're gonna skip over all the way to after you've been to court, and I'll give Judge Thornburg a heads up that I might call on you also to help us address the court system issues. But we have with us, he's been on the call from the beginning. We have Brent Bailey, who's going to talk with us about the collateral consequences of convictions. And so please go ahead, Mr. Bailey.
Thank you, ma'am. And I'm gonna just highlight one. And I think as far as reentry goes in the state, people returning to the community from prison, and I'm the coordinator of the Buncombe County Reentry Council, the local reentry council, and it's a few of those across the state. And I think that the state has done well in establishing those. Kudos to Department of Public Safety, Office of Rehabilitation Transition Services, Nicole Sullivan, all her staff. And I think it's on each community to determine that, because they know the community, they know what's offered, they know what people need. So a blanket approach, not so much. But as far as collateral consequences, and Senator Van Dyne, this is in your wheelhouse. It's nonpartisan, it's non-polarizing, but it will take political action. In North Carolina, certain level drug convictions, you still are banned lifetime from receiving SNAP benefits and food assistance. So you have a certain level drug conviction, you come out of prison, and you can't even get a basic need met, which is food assistance. And oftentimes these individuals are tax-paying citizens. And so they pay their taxes, which go to support the program, but then they're not able to participate in the program. And so it's not taxation without representation, but it's taxation without participation. And if you have means and resources and finances, then you probably will never have to rely upon food assistance. And I also want to highlight, and this has been in effect since 1996, I'm sure it was a part of the war on drugs. Obviously, some things that was implemented and passed then have been overturned, and this is another one that needs to be. But the rate of incarceration for women has been increasing. And so we tell women, you can't get food stamps, but we won't deny your children. And do we think that the women are then just not gonna eat? I wanna highlight too, Mississippi and West Virginia has overturned their ban on food stamps. And maybe this is my competitive nature, but as a North Carolinian, I don't want to come behind Mississippi and West Virginia in nothing. I don't even want to lose to them in a jelly bean counting contest. And so I think some people on here understand that as well. We need to go ahead, and I don't know if an executive order would do it, so if it's a recommendation for the governor. I don't know if it's something Senator Van Dyne could work on in the state legislature to get it passed, but I think now is the time, and it is time to overturn that. It is the only if I'm getting excited, excuse me, I'm passionate about this. I've been on this soapbox for years. It is the only conviction, certain level drug conviction, the only conviction where we make someone ineligible for food assistance. So not only is it racially disparate, it's economically unjust. It is a direct attack on the most vulnerable citizens of our society, which is the poor. Not to mention in the South, it's our culture to feed people. When did we decide we was no longer going to feed people? And so I wanted to use my time to really talk about that as a collateral consequence of conviction. There are so many more hindrances around housing, around employment. But I'm telling you, I feel like this is one that we can really make an impact on immediately and get something done. No one should have to come out and not be able and have to worry about what they're going to eat. I mean, in some respects, if that's the case, we kind of creating some crime. And so I thank you for my time to share that, and I appreciate it.
I will take that to my caucus as soon as this meeting is over.
Thank you.
No, thank you so much for that, highlighting that. There are so many collateral consequences of convictions that I think it is both an area where there's great promise, because there have been some additional steps recently to increase the availability of some expunctions, which then should help with collateral consequences. But it is really helpful to have that point highlighted. So thank you. We have a few minutes to open it up generally now to anyone who wants to have input on any aspect of the court process, from bail to charging decisions to jury selection to sentencing, to fines and fees, any areas or issues that you want to highlight as particularly salient for your community in terms of the racial disparities that we see in the criminal justice system.
Come on, Tiffany. I know you got something in you. All right.
So
Sorry.
Yeah, I'll go to Tiffany first, and then Bob Clark.
So I've been working with Judge Thornburg and all of our criminal justice stakeholders on this here locally. Right now, we've been doing a lot looking at our jail data. I know AOC is going towards a more electronic database. I think that's one of, and should be a priority, is being able to evaluate our disparities, looking at data, making sure we have access to court data, making sure that we have access to all of our justice system data to make sure that we can analyze it from every decision point possible. So whether it's a first incident with law enforcement all the way to Brent's point about re-entering. I think some things we found here locally is our average length of stay. So Blacks on average stay longer in custody. And they're booked 20% into our jail compared to our demographics of residents in Buncombe County, making up 6 to 8. I think one thing we highlight as we look towards or look down the data is all the nuance and caveat that comes up about why decisions are made. I think some things that can help improve, or looking at some best practices. I'm not gonna list them out, but I know Jessica Smith with the School of Government has made a lot of effort and work on this. I think aligning or having counties look at their and evaluating their bail bond policy, pretrial release policy, to make sure it's in alignment with general statutes. So for example, if we're being instructed per law to assess someone's ability to pay, how are we doing that? What tools or mechanisms are we doing that besides someone coming in to a decision point from a judicial official and we're making assumptions or filling out a waiver to say that I don't have funding available? I think looking at the purpose of detention. So North Carolina doesn't have a lot of preventive detention statutes, which we may not necessarily want to do. Because when that happens, we see the opposite effects or the rebound effects of preventative detention and having people in custody for long lengths of time. I think time standards have been implemented in other communities, so not having cases being processed for 2 and 3 years. For example, I know Brent knows his name, the young guy that ended up dying in New York, killing himself. He was sitting in custody waiting trial for 2 or 3 years. Thank you. I didn't want to say it wrong, actually, but his case ultimately getting dismissed. So what does time standards look like from discovery, from jury selection or going to grand jury and indictment? How long cases should be in pendency mode are some things that other counties have implemented. Making sure that our court system have resources to prosecute and to have these cases reviewed in a timely manner. And then as well, we talked about racial equity with law enforcement, racial equity tools when it comes to our court systems. I know our DA here expanded our diversion program once we started looking at the criteria. And sometimes things are not intentional, but they have unintentional harm. And so one thing racial equity lens can do is really assess, like, what is the harm to certain communities and what communities are benefiting, and how do we best account for public safety while making sure that these things are addressed. And I think lastly, what I've said is probably a plethora of others, but really being intentional in addressing the root causes for some of these issues, understanding that the actions from people are symptoms. And so a lot of our disparities we see are based on systemic issues that are creating, it's kind of called like the groundwater, or how our systems are making up these symptoms that are affecting the fish. So that's one allegory of looking at it. And I can explain that if you all aren't familiar with the fish in the lake term. So.
I am familiar with the fish in the lake, and I think other people are, but it's a great analogy. I want to just I have one question arose as you were talking, and that's about the delays in case processing, because that is certainly something we've seen at our court, where where a motion for a speedy trial is not an effective remedy for cases taking a long time. And I'm just curious, from your perspective, what is the sticking point? What is it that's causing the such a long delay in cases getting processed?
This is my, like, I'm not in the court system. I help provide support, so I'm an outsider looking in. But I think a lot of it comes to judicial strategies or court strategies to either prosecute cases or to represent the defendant, right? And so if you have somebody sitting in custody longer, it might be a tactic for, I'll say, for example, the longer discovery is not in, the more likely the prosecution may use that as a plea mechanism. Or the longer that a case atrophies, the more likely that the case might get dismissed. But I think when people have these intentions, it necessarily may complicate the disparity. There's factors into our diversion programs about not only eligibility, but who is screening the referrals, who's getting accepted to the programs. For example, treatment courts you have to plea in. There's mistrust in the court system. So I think there's a multitude of factors that need to be addressed. I think when it comes to case pendency too, the volume as well, and just not having enough staff and personnel to, focus on misdemeanor level cases, as well as giving attention and focus to higher level felonies. One thing that we did see in the data, we just looked at 15 cases. We did like a case review, and we noticed that the length of stay for folks that were assigned to counsel, so the public defender had to sign the cases out, end up having a significant or a substantially longer period or average length of stay in the detention facility. And of course, we have to start digging and exploring why that may be, doing stakeholder interviews and really trying to get to understand the nuances and caveats that happen when cases are being processed.
Is that study that you just described, is there something written up that you could share with the task force?
We're working on that. It's been internal. It's been a lot of our racial equity work group looking in and asking questions and kind of using this racial equity lens to dig a little bit deeper and understand why these things are occurring in our system. And I think we are actually in the process with our partnership with the MacArthur Foundation is releasing a study, decision point analysis, and a relative rate index that will look at the decision points that we do have through a racial equity lens and understanding where our disparity points are. And so hopefully that will be done in the next 90 days, having a draft, and then having that published before the end of the year.
Great, thank you. I promised to get to Bob Clark.
All right, I'll be brief, but the issues are big. Number one, I talk about disparity and economic disparity. Bail, cash bail is so abusive just beginning the process. And I won't belabor that. Most of you probably know the situations. Be glad to talk about it later, but don't want to waste your time. But I just see so many people put in jail, and then it's, well, I better just plead guilty and get out. It costs jobs, it costs families. Number two, it ties directly to your talk about having judges have the power to review can this person even put on probation reasonably pay a $500 fine? Court costs were $190 when I retired. They're probably about $250 now. Well, if that family hadn't scrambled to make bail, maybe so somebody could keep a job or keep their home, then that resource might be available when a judge looks down and says, well, do you think you can do this? And they can heave a sigh of relief and go, yeah, now I can go to my cousin and my brother and my mom, and we can get the money together to at least pay my fines and court costs. But putting the money in the hand of the bail bondsman, when those of us in the legal system have read what bail is supposed to mean, and again, I was a public defender and a DA, saw it from both sides, but magistrates need better training. They don't need superior court judges. No disrespect, Judge Thornburg. They don't need a superior court, or actually it's chief district court, excuse me, who usually does it, setting like a bond program. 5 years ago, if I gotten arrested in Waynesville for a $40 forged check, I'd have to post a secured bond. And you take somebody with a misdemeanor larceny and they give them a small bond, they can't make it. So anyhow, the money aspect has to be looked at up front, not after the judgment. And lastly, I really appreciate I guess last time again, Mr. Bailey's comments. Yeah, the post release has to be looked at too, because they come out with no money. Go back to the old expression, same playground, same playmates. And there just have to be some structures in place. That goes back to the overarching political will, meaning can you get the taxpayers to give money toward it? And my last comment for the day will be, I just always believe that probably better to help a person in one of our communities and be able to hit somebody with a bomb 8,000 miles away. So thank you.
Thank you. I want to just open it up final time. Is there anyone who wants to make an observation, respond to questions come up, identify an issue we haven't talked about, but you want to make sure is on our agenda? Anyone else want to speak? Sheriff Miller, yes.
I would. I just want to talk a little bit about pretrial release. I want to talk about COVID-19. And this is just my way of explaining this, is that prior to COVID-19, with all due respect to the MacArthur grant and everything locally in Buncombe County, we struggled to move the needle, if you would, that we would reduce our jail population. COVID-19 showed up and our numbers drastically reduced, almost over 100. I think the number was 40%. Tiffany may be able to help me with that number. But what I looked at COVID-19 was an opportunity to give us a template of what worked. And it was a joint effort. It wasn't the DA or the public defender's office. It was all of us, law enforcement, everyone working together to reduce the number of, I call them clients, if you probably already heard, of people who were incarcerated. So it was an overall effort by the criminal justice system to reduce the population. And I would tell you that I feel that that is effective. I think there's a way to continue that. I don't know if we want to look at mandates or not, but I think that we have to look at something that we now know that it can work, but it seems that we have to have a common goal to make it work. And COVID-19 just was the common goal, that we were interested in saving people's lives more than just have them sitting in our county jail, which I commend and thank everyone for their efforts. But in moving forward, I would really love to have the conversation, how does that continue? Is there something else we can do from law enforcement perspective to keep that? Because we issued a lot of citations opposed to arrest. The magistrates was instrumental in releasing people. And to the best of my knowledge, the crime did not increase during that period of time, which some would use as an excuse or a reason that we want to incarcerate people. But again, the crime rates did not increase. And I just would like us to, the task force, to look at that also, pre-trial release and not having people incarcerated. And please don't get this wrong, but I just don't believe everyone needs to be in our detention facilities.
Well, thank you. It sounds like that is something that that's again one of those local initiatives that in many ways you just need at the state level for us to support your efforts. You've already demonstrated it can be done. And so let us know how at the state level we can encourage your efforts. I mean, that's a really positive thing to hear.
Well, I would just also add to that is that our numbers are now trying to creep back up. So I think we have to, I guess, locally come back to the table and have the conversation of how we continue that. But any support from the city, county, state, whomever would definitely be helpful.
Okay, great. Thank you. We're almost out of time. I don't know, Judge Thornburg, did you want to make any comments or observations?
I think we've covered a lot of it. That we didn't talk about sentencing alternatives and active versus probationary sentence, or actually delaying sentencing and giving defendants an opportunity to succeed in the interim and allow them not to actually pick up the charge to start with, but have some supervision. That's been found to be productive. You know, we had that for certain low-level drug crimes and a few others, and I think it's worked well. I'd like to explore the possibility of expanding that. We have discretion to do that. In DAs, sometimes we can figure something out, but perhaps some more structure around sentencing alternatives for judges. We touched on treatment courts. Quentin Miller was on the original drug court in Buchan County, so this is near and dear to his heart. And Senator Van Dyne has been very supportive. But we have a number of those, and I think that is a direction that we need to be going in. James Ferguson mentioned earlier today just the devastation to our citizenry, and also certainly to our criminal justice system of the drug crimes, which is a public health issue. And we know that we can be successful in treating that, and it costs a lot less money, and it saves lives and families and taxpayer dollars, and puts productive citizens back in our communities. Look at that as we go forward, and perhaps, just look at the data and see what works. But those are just a couple of, and maybe look at expanding expunctions and certain crimes that would be available to be erased, and allow these folks, to get jobs when they get out. Just a few thoughts, but I think we touched on the big ones.
No, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. I am enormously grateful to all of you. I don't know, Senator Van Dyne, I just want to invite that I think from the task force perspective, we do anticipate it in December having some legislative recommendations, but having some feedback early on we have 3 legislators on our task force, but your continued involvement and feedback could really be helpful. So I just want to note that. And at this point, I will turn it over to Attorney General Stein to close us out. Thank you.
Really just words of thanks. I really appreciate everyone taking their time out of busy days and sharing a lot of provocative and creative ideas. And these are ideas that Anita and I and Judge Thornburg and Angelica and the other members of the task force that have been watching as participants, we're going to take back to our different 4 working groups, and we're going to chew on these ideas and come back with a series of recommendations so that we can all achieve the goal that we want, which is to have a better system that treats everyone fairly. And the fact that someone's Black or Latino should have no impact on what happens to them. It should just be what they did. Everyone should be treated equally. Thank you all very much. Hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you.